That joke kills. Our next performer is Gayle Towell, who is the author of the highly praised novella, Beloved Gravity. Her short stories have won the 2013 Women's National Book Association Writing Contest, the 2014 Willamette Writers K. Snow Fiction Award, and have appeared in many publications, both print and online. Gayle?
All right. So what I'm going to read for you is something that I did not write, but this person who lived a long time ago named Poe wrote. He didn't write it in exactly this version, though. This is the story Hop Frog, and Hop Frog is 3,600 words. I strategically tweaked it down to half that, so it'll be shorter, but left what I could intact. So here we go. I never knew anyone so keenly alive to a joke as the king was. Thus it happened that his 7 ministers were all noted for their accomplishments as jokers. They all took after the king, too, in being large, corpulent, oily men. Our king, as a matter of course, retained his fool. His fool, or professional jester, was not only a fool, however. His value was trebled in the eyes of the king by the fact of his also being a dwarf and a cripple. The name Hop Frog was conferred upon him on account that he could only get along by a sort of interjectional gait, something between a leap and a wriggle, a movement that afforded illimitable amusement to the king. But although Hop Frog could move only with great pain and difficulty along a road or floor, the prodigious muscular power which nature seemed to have bestowed upon his arms enabled him to perform many feats of wonderful dexterity where trees or ropes were in question. Hop Frog and a young girl very little less dwarfish than himself had been forcefully carried off from their respective homes in some distant barbarous region and sent as presents to the king by one of his ever-victorious generals. The 2 little captives soon became sworn friends. Hop Frog had it not in his power to render Trippetta many services, but she, on account of her grace and exquisite beauty, was universally admired and petted, so she possessed much influence and never failed to use it whenever she could for the benefit of Hop Frog. On some grand state occasion, the king determined to have a masquerade. The night appointed had arrived. As for costumes and characters, many had made up their minds a week or even a month in advance, and, in fact, there was not a particle of indecision anywhere except in the case of the king and his 7 ministers. As a last resort, they sent for Trippetta and Hop Frog. The 2 little friends found the king sitting at his wine with the 7 members of his cabinet council, but the monarch appeared to be in very ill humor. He knew that Hop Frog was not fond of wine, for it excited the poor cripple almost to madness, but the king took pleasure in forcing Hop Frog to drink. "Come here, Hop Frog," said he, as the jester and his friend entered the room. "We want characters, man, something novel, out of the way. Come, drink, the wine will brighten your wits." As the dwarf reluctantly drained the beaker, the king said, "Why, your eyes are already shining." Hop Frog placed the goblet nervously on the table and looked around the company with a half-insane stare. They all seemed highly amused at the success of the king's joke. Come, said the king impatiently. "Have you nothing to suggest?" "I am endeavoring to think of something novel," replied the dwarf, quite bewildered by the wine. "Endeavoring!" cried the tyrant fiercely. "You are sulky and want more wine. Here, drink this." And he poured out another gobletful and offered it to the cripple, who merely gazed at it, gasping for breath. The courtiers smirked. Trippetta, pale as a corpse, advanced to the monarch's seat and, falling to her knees before him, implored him to spare her friend. The tyrant regarded her in evident wonder of her audacity. At last, without uttering a syllable, he pushed her violently from him and threw the contents of the brimming goblet in her face. Hereupon the dwarf laughed. Moreover, he avowed his perfect willingness to swallow as much wine as desired. The monarch was pacified, and having drained another bumper with no very perceptible ill effect, Hop Frog entered with spirit into the plans for the masquerade. I cannot tell what was the association of idea, observed he, very tranquilly, and as if he had never tasted wine in his life. But just after your majesty had struck the girl and thrown the wine in her face, there came into my mind a capital diversion, one of my own country frolics, often enacted among us at our masquerades. But here it will be new altogether. Come, what is the diversion? Cried the king. We call it, replied the cripple, the 8 chained orangutans. And it really is excellent sport if well enacted. The beauty of the game lies in the fright it occasions among the women. Capital, roared the monarch. I will equip you as orangutans, proceeded the dwarf. Leave all that to me. The resemblance shall be so striking that the company of masqueraders will take you for real beasts, and of course they will be as much terrified as astonished. Oh, this is exquisite, exclaimed the king. The chains are for the purpose of increasing the confusion by their jangling. You are supposed to have escaped en masse from your keepers. Your majesty cannot conceive of the effect produced at a masquerade by 8 chained orangutans, imagined to be real ones by most of the company, and rushing in with savage cries among the crowd of delicately and gorgeously habited men and women. The contrast is imitable. It must be, said the king, and the council arose hurriedly to put in execution the scheme of Hop Frog. The king and his ministers were first encased in tight-fitting stocking-net shirts and drawers. They were then saturated with tar and coated with flax. A long chain was passed about the waist of the king and tied, then about all successively in the same manner. The grand saloon in which the masquerade was to take place was a circular room, very lofty, and receiving the light of the sun only through a single window at top. At night, it was illuminated principally by a large chandelier, depending by a chain from the center of the skylight, and lowered or elevated by means of a counterbalance as usual, but this latter passed outside the cupola and over the roof. The arrangements of the room had been left to Trippetta's superintendence, but in some particulars, it seems, she had been guided by the calmer judgment of her friend the dwarf. At his suggestion, the chandelier was removed. The 8 orangutans, taking Hop Frog's advice, waited patiently until midnight before making their appearance. As had been anticipated, there were not a few of the guests who supposed the ferocious-looking creatures to be beasts of some kind in reality, if not precisely orangutans. Many of the women swooned with affright, and had not the king taken precaution to exclude all weapons from the saloon, his party might soon have expiated their frolic in their blood. As it was, a general rush was made for the doors, but the king had ordered them to be locked immediately upon his entrance, and, at the dwarf's suggestions, the keys had been deposited with him. While the tumult was at its height, and each masquerader attentive only to his own safety, the chain by which the chandelier ordinarily hung, and which had been drawn up on its removal, might have been seen to very gradually descend until its hooked extremity came within 3 feet of the floor. Soon after this, the king and his 7 friends, having reeled about the hall in all directions, found themselves at length in its center, and, of course, in immediate contact with the chain. While they were thus situated, the dwarf took hold of their own chain. Here he inserted the hook from which the chandelier had been wont to depend, and in an instant, by some unseen agency, the chandelier chain was drawn so far upward as to take the hook out of reach, and, as an inevitable consequence, to drag the orangutans together in close connection. The masqueraders had recovered in some measure from their alarm, and beginning to regard the whole matter as a well-contrived pleasantry, set up a loud shout of laughter at the predicament of the apes. "Leave them to me," screamed Hop Frog, his shrill voice making itself easily heard through all the din. "I fancy I know them. If I can only get a good look at them, I can soon tell who they are." He seized a torch and returned to the center of the room, leaping with the agility of a monkey upon the king's head, and thence clambered a few feet up the chain. And now, while the whole assembly, the apes included, were convulsed with laughter, the jester uttered a shrill whistle, and the chain flew violently up about 30 feet, dragging with it the dismayed and struggling orangutans, and leaving them suspended in midair between the skylight and the floor. Hop Frog, clinging to the chain as it rose, thrust his torch down toward the 8 maskers, as though endeavoring to discover who they were. "Aha! I begin to see who these people are now," said the jester, pretending to scrutinize the king more closely. He held the flame to the flaxen coat which enveloped him, and which instantly burst into a sheet of vivid flame. In less than half a minute, the whole 8 orangutans were blazing fiercely amid the shrieks of the multitude who gazed at them from below, horror-stricken and without the power to render them the slightest assistance. The flames forced the jester to climb higher up the chain, and, as he made this movement, the crowd sank into silence. The dwarf seized his opportunity and once more spoke. "I now see distinctly," he said, "what manner of people these maskers are. They are a king who does not scruple to strike a defenseless girl, and his 7 counselors who abet him in the outrage. As for myself, I am simply Hop Frog, the jester, and this is my last jest." The dwarf had scarcely made an end of his brief speech before the work of vengeance was complete. The 8 corpses swung in their chains, a fetid, blackened, hideous, and indistinguishable mass. The cripple hurled his torch at them, clambered leisurely to the ceiling, and disappeared through the skylight. It is supposed that Trippetta, stationed on the roof of the saloon, had been the accomplice of her friend in his fiery revenge, and that together they effected their escape to their own country, for neither was seen again.
Take out all these musical instruments. I'm going to trip, and I'm going to fall, and I'm going to ruin everything. Thank you, Gayle. And Towell had a thing for orangutans. Like, you guys know, right? That's one of the spoilers, 140 years after the fact, but Murders in the Rue Morgue, right? Orangutan? Okay.